Ranger Wendell described to me the night that changed him. It is 1:14 in the morning on a Forest Service spur road in the southern Washington Cascades. 19 degrees, no moon, and his headlights catch a shape crouched beside a hunter's truck that he first reads as a wolf on all fours. Then the shape rises. It keeps rising. It comes up onto two legs, and it stands fully upright in the cone of his high beams. 7 feet tall, canine head, long arms hanging past its knees, fur matted dark along the chest, and for almost 4 seconds, it looks directly into the windshield of his cruiser before it turns and walks on its hind legs, the way a man walks, into the trees on the far side of the road. He does not draw his sidearm. He does not get out of the cruiser. He sits with both hands on the wheel and watches the place in the trees where it went, and he knows, in the way you know things you're never going to be able to explain to anyone, that the rest of his career has just been divided into before and after. The envelope showed up at my P.O. box on a Tuesday in late October. Manila, letter-sized, no return address, postmarked Randall, Washington. I get a lot of mail for this channel, and most of it I opened standing at the counter at the post office, because I'm impatient and because I like the ritual. This one I took home. I don't know why. Something about the weight of it, or the way the address was written by hand in black ballpoint, in the careful, blocky print of a man who learned to write before computers. Inside were 47 photocopied pages. A hand-drawn map of a Forest Service road grid in the southern Washington Cascades, 3 locations circled in red pen, and a single sheet of yellow legal pad with 1 sentence on it. You said you wanted real ones. Here are mine. No signature, just initials at the bottom. WB. I'm going to tell you about the man who sent me that envelope. I'm going to tell you about 3 incidents he investigated personally during his 31 years as a United States Forest Service law enforcement officer, the last 19 of them in Gifford Pinchot National Forest. I'm going to tell you about the one that ended his career. And I'm going to tell you why a stack of incident reports filed between 1994 and 2009 in a federal land management district covering 1 1/3 million acres of Washington state are not in any public forest service database, and why, according to the man who wrote them, they were never going to be. Before we go any further, I want you to know one thing. Skamania County, Washington, is the only county in the United States with a law on the books making it a crime to kill a Sasquatch. Ordinance number 69-01, passed by the county commissioners on April 1st, 1969, amended in 1984 to define the species as endangered. Still in effect as of this recording. The local government of the place I'm about to take you, in writing, in the public record, decided that something was out there and that something needed legal protection. Hold on to that. We're going to come back to it. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read everyone. Thanks. I sat on that envelope for almost 3 weeks before I said a word about it on camera because I wanted to verify what could be verified before I put any of it in front of you. I drove up to the Cispus River area in the middle of October. I'll tell you about that trip as we go. It's part of this story now, whether I want it to be or not. But I want you to understand from the beginning that I'm not asking you to take anything in this video on faith. I'm telling you what's in the packet. I'm telling you what I could check and what I couldn't. You decide what you do with it. That's how we've always done this. The man who sent me the envelope was born in Morton, Washington in 1963. He joined the Forest Service in 1986 as a seasonal trail crew member. He earned his law enforcement officer badge in 1990. He worked districts in Oregon and Northern California for 4 years, and then transferred to Gifford Pinchot in 1994, where he stayed until he was forced into retirement in March of 2010. I'm going to call him Wendell Briggs. That's not his real name. The name is the only thing in this video I've changed, and I've changed it because he asked me to. Everything else is in the packet. Wendell was the kind of ranger who carried a Smith & Wesson .357 on his hip because he was the closest law enforcement to incidents that sometimes took a Skamania County Sheriff's deputy 4 hours to reach. He wrote everything down. He kept carbon copies of his own reports in a metal filing cabinet at his house, because by his own account he had figured out by 1995 that some of the originals were going missing from the district office in Randall. I want you to sit with that for a second. A sworn federal law enforcement officer, on his own initiative, started keeping a private archive of his own paperwork because he no longer trusted the chain of custody at his own employer. That's not paranoia. That's a man who watched something happen enough times that he changed his behavior. I want to talk about Gifford Pinchot itself before we get into the incidents, because the place is the story as much as anything in the packet. 1.3 million acres of national forest land in southern Washington. Mount St. Helens sits inside it. So does Mount Adams on the eastern boundary. Old-growth Douglas fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, Pacific silver fir at elevation. Drainages so steep that searchers in the 1980s lost cadaver dogs in them and never recovered the dogs. The Forest Service road grid was laid down by logging operations in the 1950s and 60s, paved in places, gravel in most, and over the last 30 years, it's been progressively decommissioned. Gates rusted shut, pavement breaking up. Whole districts that you used to be able to drive into are now reachable only on foot, and only if you know where the old spurs are. I drove parts of that grid in October. Forest Road 25 runs north to south through the heart of it, following the Cispus River for a long stretch. You lose cell signal a quarter mile after you leave pavement. The canopy closes overhead in places where the second growth has come in thick, and the light underneath has that green submerged quality that I associate in my own head with being somewhere I'm not really supposed to be. I'm not a man who scares easy in the woods. I've made enough of these videos and walked enough of these places that I've gotten reasonably calibrated about what's real fear and what's just the dark playing games. Gifford Pinchot was different. I'll come back to that. I want to talk about the indigenous frame here too, and I want to do it carefully because this is the part where these videos can go badly if I'm not honest with you. The Cowlitz and the Upper Cowlitz peoples have lived in and around what is now Gifford Pinchot National Forest for thousands of years. Their oral traditions include a being called Tsemekwes, which most ethnographers since the late 1800s have categorized alongside other Pacific Northwest Sasquatch traditions. But the Cowlitz also have a separate category, distinct from Tsemekwes, that some elders describe to early ethnographers as something closer to stick people, or in one 1922 transcription, the ones that walk on hind legs but are not men, and are not the hairy ones either. That second category is older, smaller in number, and in every account I've been able to read, more dangerous. I want to be completely straight with you about something. The word werewolf in the title of this video is not the right word. It was never the right word. It's the word that settlers reached for, and later, the word that some of the rangers themselves reached for in their reports, because European folklore was the only vocabulary they had for an upright, canine-shaped thing in the woods. Wendell himself, in his paperwork, uses the word dogman. So does the boy I'm going to tell you about toward the end of this video. I'm going to use both words because both of them are in the documents, and I'm going to ask you to hold both of them loosely because what the Cowlitz were describing long before any United States Forest Service ranger ever set foot in those drainages doesn't need our European categories to keep existing. Here's what's at stake in the packet. 3 incidents. People were hurt in all of them. 1 person died. Several of them never spoke publicly about what happened to them, and as far as I know, they still haven't. And Wendell Briggs is willing to say, through me, on the record, that the United States Forest Service made a deliberate institutional choice somewhere in the mid to late 1990s in the Gifford Pinchot district to stop generating searchable paperwork on a specific category of incident. He believes this. I am telling you, he believes it. I'll show you what I could verify and what I couldn't. The question that drove me on that drive in October, and the question I want you to carry with you for the next 40 minutes, is this. What would make a federal land management agency decide quietly, and without ever saying so out loud, that some reports just shouldn't exist? Let me tell you about the first incident. November of 1997. The night before the first hard freeze of the season, a 52-year-old millwright from Longview, Washington, was parked at a turnout off Forest Road 25 near the confluence of Iron Creek and the Cispus River. I'm going to call him Ray because that's the pseudonym Wendell used in the packet, and I'm not going to do better than the man who took the original report. Ray had been hunting blacktail in that drainage every season for 19 years. Same general area, same week. He knew the country. He had killed 6 deer out of that drainage over the years, and he had never had anything happen to him out there. Worse than a flat tire. He was sleeping in the cab of his Ford F-250 because the forecast had dropped to 19 degrees and his tent stove had failed earlier in the evening. He had a sleeping bag pulled up to his chin and his boots on the floorboard. The dashboard clock read 1:38 a.m. when he woke up. He remembered the time precisely because the dashboard clock was the last thing he saw before the driver's side window made a sound that he later described to Wendell as ice in a glass when you pour hot water on it, except slower. The window did not break. It bowed inward. Safety glass crazed into a dense web of cracks and pushed 3 to 4 inches into the cab without coming apart. Ray rolled across the bench seat away from it. 40 seconds later, give or take, the passenger window did the same thing. He was now lying on his back across the bench with his knees pulled up and his sleeping bag still around his legs, looking up at the ceiling of his own truck. And he could not see anything outside the glass because the dome light was on and the world beyond was solid black. What he could hear was breathing, slow, wet, from 2 different sides of the truck simultaneously, and then a single sound that he could only describe to Wendell and later to me through Wendell's notes as a long exhale that had a voice in it, like someone trying to talk underwater. Ray had a cell phone. This is 1997, so a cell phone in a hunting truck in the southern Washington Cascades was not a guaranteed thing, and the signal at that turnout was, and still is, marginal at best. He got through to 911 at 1:51 a.m. Skamania County Dispatch took the call. The closest law enforcement officer was Wendell Briggs, 26 road miles out. He arrived at the turnout at 2:14 a.m. Wendell's report from that morning is in the packet. He notes that when he pulled in, both windows of Ray's truck were bowed inward and webbed but intact. The dome light was on, and Ray was lying flat across the bench seat with both hands pressed against the inside of the windshield and his eyes open. Wendell knocked on the glass and identified himself. Ray did not respond for almost 4 minutes. When he finally did open the door, the first thing he asked was whether Wendell had a partner with him. Wendell said no. Ray said he had counted 3 sets of footsteps in the gravel. I'm going to read you one sentence from Wendell's report, and then I'm going to put it down. Subject was non-responsive to verbal commands for approximately 4 minutes after my arrival. Wendell walked the perimeter of the truck with his flashlight. After he got Ray calmed down enough to get out of the cab, he found the tracks, 3 distinct sets of them in the gravel and the soft dirt at the edge of the turnout. 2 of the sets were partial and overlapping. The third one, on the driver's side, where Ray had heard the breathing closest to his head, was clear enough that Wendell could photograph it with the disposable camera he kept in the glove compartment of his cruiser for exactly this kind of thing. The clearest print showed what looked like a heel pad and a forward pad, the way you'd see on a large canine, but the toes were elongated, 4 of them, splayed and pressed deep enough into the dirt to suggest weight on the front of the foot. The stride length between consecutive prints in that set was 71 inches. Wendell measured it twice with a tape measure from his cruiser kit. 71 inches, almost 6 feet between footfalls. He photographed the measurement. Those photographs are in the packet. I have looked at them. They are bad 90s film stock, printed on a home photocopier at low resolution, and I can't tell you what they prove. I can tell you that the prints, as Wendell described them, and as the photos faintly show, do not match anything in the North American mammal field guides I keep on my shelf. I checked. I'm not a tracker. I'm not pretending to be. I'm telling you what I did and what I found. Here is the part of the first incident that I want you to remember when we get to the institutional section later in this video. When Wendell filed his incident report the next morning at the district office in Randall, his immediate supervisor read it, set it down, and told him to refile it as a bear encounter with vehicle damage. Wendell refused. The original report was logged into the district system with an incident number. 2 weeks later, when Ray called Wendell to ask for a copy of the report for his auto insurance claim on the windows, Wendell drove to the office to pull it. The report number still existed in the index. The folder was empty. That was the first time, by his own account, that Wendell Briggs understood there was something wrong with how his district was handling certain calls. I drove out to that turnout in October. It's still there. Wide gravel bay on the east side of Forest Road 25, just past the Iron Creek confluence. There's a single rusted picnic table at the back of it, and a Forest Service sign so faded by 28 years of Cascade rain that the lettering is gone entirely. I parked where Ray would have parked. I got out of the car. The Cispus runs about 200 yards downslope of the turnout, and you can hear it from the gravel, even with the wind in the firs above you. The canopy closes over the road in both directions, and the road itself just sort of disappears into the trees. I stood there for about 10 minutes. I'd brought a notebook with me to write down sensory details for this script. I wrote down 3 lines, and then I put the notebook back in my jacket, and I got in the car, and I drove out before the lights started going. I'm not going to pretend I toughed it out. I've stood in a lot of places for this channel. Some of them have made the back of my neck go cold, and some of them haven't. That one I didn't like. I left. Let me tell you about the second incident. Summer of 2003. A 4-person Forest Service trail maintenance crew was working a reroute on the Boundary Trail east of Mount Margaret, inside the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument, which sits inside the Gifford Pinchot National Forest boundary. 2 men, 2 women, ages 22 to 31, all seasonal employees. The crew leader was a returning seasonal in her 3rd year, and I'm going to call her Kara, because that's what she's called in Wendell's notes. If you've never been to the Mount Margaret backcountry, I want you to picture it. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens blew out the entire north side of that mountain and laid down a debris field across thousands of acres. 23 years later, in the summer of 2003, the regrowth was patchy. Silver snags from the original blast still standing in places, pumice slopes you sink into up to your ankles, lupine and fireweed coming back in the basins. It's beautiful country in a strange, chastened way, and it is also some of the most isolated terrain in the Cascade Range. The crew was camped at a small lake basin reachable only on foot. 3 tents. Bare canister. Protocol. No firearms, because Forest Service trail crews are not armed. The first night at that camp, nothing happened. The second night, Kara woke up at what she later estimated was around 3 in the morning to the sound of one of the male crew members sleeping in his own tent, about 40 feet away from hers, having a conversation. Not yelling, not panicking, just talking. The cadence of someone who is awake and talking to someone they know. She lay there for maybe a minute listening, decided he was sleep-talking, and went back to sleep. In the morning, the crew member had no memory of waking up at any point during the night. He insisted on this. He was upset about it because he was the kind of person who prided himself on being a sound sleeper. What all 4 of them found when they came out of their tents at first light was a ring of disturbed ground around the perimeter of their camp, soil pressed down in roughly oval depressions, each one about 10 to 14 inches long and 4 to 6 inches wide, spaced 8 to 11 feet apart, forming a near-perfect circle around all 3 tents at a radius Kara later measured as approximately 55 feet, 23 depressions in total. Kara counted them twice. She photographed them with the crew's documentation camera, which they carried for trail work records. The crew radioed it in around 8 in the morning. Wendell caught the call because he was the law enforcement officer on rotation that week. He drove as far as the road allowed, which in the Mount Margaret area in 2003 was not very far, and he hiked the last 6 miles in. He arrived at the lake basin in the late afternoon. The depressions were still visible. The ground in that part of the monument is volcanic ash and pumice mixed with developing soil, and it holds an impression for a long time. Wendell measured them. He photographed them. He took soil samples from inside several of the depressions because the soil in 2 of them had been disturbed in a way that suggested something had been pressed into it with weight. And in 2 of those samples, Wendell found what he described as clumps of coarse hair, dark brown to black, with a follicle structure that he, after 17 years of carrying a federal law enforcement badge in the Pacific Northwest, and looking at a lot of animal hair in the course of his job, did not recognize. He bagged the hair. He logged the bags with chain of custody numbers. He hiked them out the next morning and drove them back to Randall and shipped them to the regional office in Portland for forwarding to a federal lab. He never saw a result. 6 weeks later, when he asked his supervisor about it, he was told the samples had been lost in transit. When he asked again, in writing, 3 months after that, he received a single-page memo from a name he didn't recognize at the regional office, stating that the samples had been determined to be of non-evidentiary value and disposed of. Wendell kept the original chain of custody form. He kept the carbon copy of his shipping manifest with the tracking number. They are both in the packet I'm holding right now. The chain of custody form is signed by him and by the receiving clerk in Portland. It exists. The samples did not get lost in transit. The samples got somewhere, and then they got disappeared, and I am not using that word lightly. Kara, the crew leader, finished out her season and then quit the Forest Service at the end of 2003. Wendell tracked her down in 2011 for a personal conversation off the record after he had retired and was no longer in any official capacity. She told him she had not slept through a full night since that summer. She told him the male crew member who had been talking in his tent that night had described to her, years later, a dream from that night in which something at the door of his tent had asked him, in a voice he recognized as his older brother's, to please come outside. His older brother had been dead for 6 years. I want to stop here for a second, because we have done videos on this channel before about the thing where the woods learn to talk to you in voices you recognize. The Cowlitz have a word for it. The Yakima, just over the Cascade crest, have a word for it. The Dene down in the southwest have a word for it. The Ojibwe in the Great Lakes have a word for it. The Inuit on the North Slope have a word for it. Different languages, different geographies, different climates, different everything. Same warning. Don't answer if it sounds like someone you know. And especially don't answer if it sounds like someone who shouldn't be there. I'm not the first person to notice this. Anyone who has spent any time reading the ethnographic literature has noticed it. What I'm starting to think, and I'll say it plainly, because the people who watch this channel deserve me being plain with them, is that when a warning shows up independently in dozens of unrelated cultures across an entire continent, the most parsimonious explanation is not that all of those cultures invented the same fairy tale. The most parsimonious explanation is that they were all looking at the same thing. I want to step back from the incidents for a few minutes and walk you through the institutional side of this carefully, because the title of this video promises you a government cover-up, and I do not want to use that phrase the way some channels use it. I want to show you what is documented, what is claimed, and what I personally was and was not able to verify. Documented Fact 1. Skamania County Ordinance Number 69-01, passed by the Skamania County Board of Commissioners on April 1st, 1969, made the killing of a Sasquatch, quote, any nocturnal primate mammal variously described as an ape, end quote, a felony punishable by a $10,000 fine and up to 5 years in jail. Yes, the date was April 1st. The commissioners later insisted repeatedly that the timing was unintentional. The ordinance was amended in 1984 to downgrade the offense to a gross misdemeanor and to formally define the species as endangered within county boundaries. The ordinance is real. You can look it up. It is still on the books in 2026. This is not a joke ordinance. Whatever started it, it got serious enough that the county felt the need to amend it 15 years later instead of repealing it. Documented Fact 2. There is a documented record available through Freedom of Information Act releases from the late 1970s of internal United States Forest Service correspondence in the Pacific Northwest region indicating that field personnel were receiving informal guidance not to file incident reports, referencing, quote, unidentified bipedal animals, end quote, because of concerns about public relations and resource management implications. This is in the public record. It's not classified, and it never was classified. It's just not something anyone in the agency has ever discussed publicly. The memos exist. I have read them. Documented Fact 3. Wendell Briggs was employed by the United States Forest Service from 1986 to 2010. He held a law enforcement officer badge from 1990 onward. He worked in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest from 1994 until his retirement. His personnel record is verifiable through the standard channels, and I verified it. Wendell's claim, and I am framing this as his claim and not as established fact, is that what existed informally in the 1970s as a kind of soft guidance not to put certain things in writing became, by the mid-1990s in the Gifford Pinchot district specifically, a more deliberate filtering practice. Reports involving certain physical descriptions, certain track measurements, certain witness statements were rerouted, refiled under other categories, or simply not entered into the searchable district database. Wendell believes this was done at the district level rather than from the regional or national office, and he believes it was done by a small number of supervisors acting on what they understood to be informal guidance that had hardened into informal policy. Wendell's personal carbon copies, the 47 pages in my envelope, are, in his own words, the only reason any of these incidents exist on paper anywhere. I have to be honest with you about the limit of what I can verify here. I can verify that Wendell worked for the Forest Service. I can verify the Skamania Ordinance. I can verify the 1970s FOIA documents. I can verify by checking the incident numbering system used by Skamania County Dispatch that the incidents Wendell describes received dispatch numbers consistent with the dates and times in his reports. I cannot independently verify that a deliberate suppression program existed in the Gifford Pinchot district in the 1990s and 2000s. What I can tell you is that Wendell's packet contains 47 pages of paperwork that should be in a federal database, and demonstrably is not. That part is checkable. I checked it. The reports are not in the Public Forest Service incident database. They are not in any FOIA-released archive I can access. They exist in a metal filing cabinet in a small house in Randall, Washington, and now in a manila envelope on my desk. And that is, as far as I can determine, the entire universe in which they exist. I want to tell you about the third incident. Now, this is the one that ended Wendell's career. I'm going to handle it carefully, because there is a family involved, and there is a person who is still alive who was 14 years old when this happened, and who has, to the best of my knowledge, never spoken publicly about it. I am not going to try to find him. I am not going to name him. I am going to tell you what is in the report. October of 2009. A father and his 14-year-old son drove up from Vancouver, Washington, on a Friday afternoon for a weekend blacktail hunt on a permit unit south of Randall. The father was an experienced hunter. He had been taking his son hunting since the boy was 9. They had hunted that unit together twice before. They were expected back at the truck by Sunday at noon. Sunday at noon came and went, and the truck did not move. The mother, who was tracking them by a check-in protocol they had used for years, called the sheriff at 9 in the evening on Sunday. By 11, Wendell was the law enforcement officer coordinating the initial response with Skamania Search and Rescue. The truck was found at the trailhead at 1 in the morning on Monday. Cold rain, 38 degrees, the kind of Cascade autumn night where hypothermia becomes the leading cause of death within a small number of hours. If you're not properly equipped, both rifles were locked in the cab of the truck. Both packs were gone, which was consistent with a day hunt. The father's hunting jacket, his outer insulated layer, was on the driver's seat of the truck, neatly folded. That detail, the folded jacket, is the one Wendell flagged immediately when he got there. The father was an experienced, cold weather hunter. He would not have walked away from his truck on a 38-degree October day without his outer layer. And even if some emergency had caused him to remove it in a hurry, he would not have folded it. Someone had folded that jacket after it came off, and Wendell wrote that observation into his initial scene notes at 1:45 Monday morning before any other element of the search had developed. The search ran for 9 days. Skamania SAR teams, dog teams from 2 counties, volunteer ground searchers, a National Guard helicopter once the weather cleared on day 4. On day 3, in the late morning, a SAR team working a drainage 4.2 miles from the trailhead found the son. He was alive. He was sitting upright against the base of a Douglas fir stump in a small clearing. He was hypothermic but conscious. He had no injuries that the responders could see. His pack was beside him, intact. His water bottle was empty. He could not say where his father was. He could not say how he had gotten to the clearing. He repeated one phrase to the first SAR responder who reached him. "It told me to wait here." The The responders got him wrapped in a thermal blanket and started him toward the trailhead. He walked under his own power for the first half mile, and then they had to carry him. He did not speak again to any of the responders during the evacuation. He was admitted to a hospital in Vancouver that evening for treatment of moderate hypothermia and shock. The father was found on day 7. I'm going to handle this part the way Wendell handled it in his report, which is to say, I'm going to tell you what was found and where, and I'm going to leave out the details that don't serve any purpose except to upset you. The body was located 1.8 miles further into the same drainage where the son had been found. The position of the body did not match a fall. It did not match an animal predation event of any species native to the Cascade Range. It did not match exposure as a sole cause. The official cause of death listed by the Skamania County Coroner after the body was recovered was exposure with contributing trauma, mechanism undetermined. The body was released to the family for burial. There was no further investigation. Wendell saw the body in situ before the coroner did, because Wendell was the federal LEO on scene, and the recovery had to be coordinated with the Forest Service before the body could be moved off federal land. His personal notes from that morning are the most difficult documents in the packet to read, and I'm not going to read them to you. I'm going to give you one sentence of his that I think you need to hear, and then I'm going to move on. I have seen people killed by bears, by cougars, by other people, and by the cold. This was none of those things. Wendell filed his incident report on the recovery on day 8. He attached photographs. He attached a transcription of the son's initial statement to the SAR responder, including the phrase about being told to wait. He attached a supplementary statement that the boy had given to a hospital social worker 48 hours after admission, in which the boy described being lifted, being carried, being set down, and being told, in his father's voice, to close his eyes and count to 1,000 and not stop counting until someone came for him. Wendell's report was returned to him 3 days later, on October 28th, 2009, with written instructions from his district supervisor to revise the report and remove all references to the son's statements and to the elements of the father's body condition that were inconsistent with the coroner's determination of exposure with contributing trauma. Wendell refused in writing. He was placed on administrative leave on October 31st, 2009, pending a review of his fitness for duty. The review was never formally completed. He was offered an early retirement package in February of 2010. He accepted it in March. He has not worked for the United States Forest Service since. The original unredacted incident report is the longest single document in the packet I have. It is 22 pages. It is signed and dated by Wendell Briggs. It is the only copy of that report that exists outside of whatever the Forest Service did or did not do with the version they ordered him to revise. The son is now 30 years old. He lives somewhere in eastern Washington. According to Wendell, he has never spoken publicly about that night, and according to Wendell, he should not have to. I agree with Wendell. We are not going to try to find him. If you are watching this video and you know who he is, please respect what he has chosen and do not put his name in the comments. I want to tell you about the phone call I had with Wendell after I read the packet for the first time. He agreed to one phone call. No recording. No video. No name on camera. I called him on a Wednesday morning in early October from my kitchen with a notebook in front of me and a cup of coffee that I forgot to drink until it was cold. We talked for about an hour and 20 minutes. He answered every question I asked him directly. He did not embellish anything. He did not push me to believe him. There were 2 moments in the call when he stopped talking for long enough that I thought the line had dropped, and both times, when he started talking again, his voice was different in a way I do not have a good word for. Quieter. Older. The voice of a man who has been holding something for a very long time, and who is finally setting it down. Not because he wants to be believed, but because he wants it to exist somewhere outside his own head before he dies. He's 63 now. He has a daughter and 2 grandchildren. He told me near the end of the call that the reason he sent me the envelope was that he had watched the Winta Mountains video I made last year, and he had noticed something about how I handled the indigenous material. He didn't say what. He said he just wanted the records to be somewhere. A person who would handle them carefully could decide what to do with them. He said he was not asking me to make a video. He said he was not asking me to do anything. He said he just didn't want them to die in his filing cabinet. I'm making the video. I'm making it because I think the records should exist out loud. I'm making it because I think the people in those reports, the millwright and the trail crew leader and the boy in the clearing, deserve to have someone say plainly that what happened to them happened, even if we don't know what to call the thing that happened. And I'm making it because I think the question of what a federal land management agency does with reports it does not want to acknowledge is a real question, and one that the people who pay for that agency with their taxes have a right to ask. I know what some of you are going to write in the comments. I know some of you are going to say this is folklore or fiction or one bitter retired ranger with an axe to grind and a manila envelope full of made-up paperwork. I'm not going to argue with you. I have told you what's in the packet. I have told you what I could check and what I couldn't. I have told you the name of the forest, the name of the county, the number of the ordinance, and the dates of the incidents. I have not told you the real name of the man who sent me the envelope, and I am not going to, ever, no matter how many times anyone asks. I want to come back to the word werewolf before I close this out, because I told you at the beginning that it was the wrong word, and I owe you a clean accounting of what I think the right word is, or at least what the right shape of an answer looks like. The European werewolf is a man who becomes a wolf under the moon. That is a story about transformation and about the animal hidden inside the human. It is a story that belongs to a particular continent and a particular set of anxieties about the boundary between civilization and the wild. The thing that Wendell Briggs wrote reports about in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest between 1994 and 2009 is not that. The thing the Cowlitz elders described to ethnographers 100 years ago is not that either. What Wendell wrote about and what the Cowlitz described is something that walks on its hind legs, has a canine shape to its head and its limbs, weighs enough to bow safety glass without breaking it, leaves a stride of 71 inches in soft dirt, has hair with a follicle structure that doesn't match anything in a federal lab's reference collection, and can produce sounds and voices that belong to people the listener knows. That is not a man becoming a wolf. That is something else entirely, something that was here before the word werewolf was coined in any European language, and something that is still here in the drainages east of Mount Margaret and along the Cispus River and in the decommissioned spur roads that nobody drives anymore. The rangers reached for werewolf because it was the closest word they had. The Forest Service reached for bear encounter, vehicle damage, and exposure with contributing trauma because those were the closest categories the institution had. The Cowlitz, who had thousands of years to develop their vocabulary, had a different word, and the elders who used it did not use it lightly. And the people I have read who wrote it down 100 years ago did not treat it as decoration. They treated it as data. So do I. I drove out of Gifford Pinchot late on a Wednesday afternoon in October after I'd spent the morning at the Iron Creek turnout and the afternoon driving slow loops on a couple of the spur roads that were still passable. The light was coming sideways through the firs the way it does in the Cascades in the fall, golden green and a little tired. I passed a Forest Service gate on a decommissioned spur road that was not on my map. The gate was rusted and chained, and the spur went off into the trees on a steep grade and disappeared after maybe 30 yards into the second growth. I slowed down. I thought about stopping. I thought about getting out and walking up to the gate and looking at the lock and the chain to see if they were as old as everything else out there, or whether someone was still maintaining them. I didn't stop. I kept driving. I'm telling you that I didn't stop, because the man you watch on this channel does not lie to you about the things he does and doesn't do. And because I want you to understand that I am not braver than you are, and I am not smarter than you are, and I am not somehow protected from the things I make videos about. I just write them down. I think about Wendell in a small house in Randall, Washington, with a metal filing cabinet full of carbon copies that the federal government would prefer did not exist. I think about Ray the millwright, who according to Wendell never hunted again after that November morning in 1997, and who died of an unrelated heart attack in 2016 without ever telling his grown children what had happened to him in his truck on Forest Road 25. I think about Kara, the trail crew leader, who hasn't slept through a full night since 2003, and who lives now in a small town in Oregon and works as a high school biology teacher. I think about a 14-year-old boy in a clearing, hypothermic and alone, counting to 1,000 in the dark, in a voice that was not his father's voice, because he had been told to count, and because some small part of him understood that if he stopped counting, the thing that had told him to start would come back. And I think about Skamania County Ordinance 69-01, passed on April 1st, 1969, amended in 1984, still on the books in 2026, a law against killing something the federal government officially insists is not there. Here's the question I am going to leave you with. I am not going to answer it for you. I have spent the last 40 minutes telling you what I know and what I don't know, and you are an adult, and you can do with all of it what you decide to do with it. If there was nothing in those forests, why would anyone ever need to write a law like that? And if there was something out there, what would it actually take, exactly, for the people whose job it is to manage that land to admit it out loud? I don't know. Wendell Briggs doesn't know either. He just knows what he wrote down, and he knows what they told him to take out, and he knows that his daughter has 2 children now, and that he would like very much for them to grow up in a world where the records exist somewhere a person can find them. The records exist now. They exist in a manila envelope on my desk. They exist in this video. They exist because a man who carried a federal badge for 19 years in one of the wildest national forests in the lower 48 states decided near the end of his life that some things are worse than not being believed. And the worst of those things is silence. If this is the kind of work you want more of, subscribe. Tell me in the comments what you think, and if you have your own story from the Cascades, from Gifford Pinchot, from anywhere along Forest Road 25, or the Boundary Trail, or the country east of Mount Margaret, tell me that too. I read every comment. I always have. Thanks for staying with me. I'll see you on the next one.